Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our virtual BESTPRAC EARMA meeting. Just to remind you that our event is being recorded and will be available afterwards to both EARMA's and BESTPRAC's website. You can use the chat to introduce yourself and the country you are coming from, and the Q&A to pose your questions to the speakers. Today we will have three keynote speakers, and then we will have a very short break and we will move on to the parallel sessions. We will not come back to the plenary session. Since yesterday, the number of the registered participants increased to 764, which is great. And thank you for that. We had an amazing first day with quite interesting and helpful presentations. Hence, I propose we start the day with our first keynote speaker. Professor Peter van de Besseler is Professor Emeritus at the Vrije University Amsterdam and specializes in the science of science. He is also scientific advisor at the German Center for Higher Education and Science Studies in Berlin. He will speak about the effects of writing style on grant application success based on a study of the ERC starting grants. Professor Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll share my screen. I hope it works like this.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to present our work on writing style and grant application success, which is an exciting field, I would say. So what I'll do in the next about 30 minutes is briefly go into different factors that predict grant success, and then switch to linguistic approaches to grant writing. This is a fairly new field, I would say. There is a little bit research on it, but not very much. Then I go into our case. So we did an empirical study on this, go then over to the results and some implications. I have to acknowledge and also here my co-author of the paper, Charlie, who did a lot of work on it too. Okay, so what predicts grant success? What our study clearly shows is that past performance has an influence, productivity and citation impact. Of course, it differs a little bit between the research fields. Which indicators there have the strongest effect, but overall it has a positive effect. And then what you could also imagine is that earlier grants have a positive effect of winning a new grant. Also here we see the well-known Matthew effect. And then the question, of course, is what about the quality of the proposal? This is a more difficult thing. First of all, because it's difficult to measure the quality of proposals, but also because it's not so clear whether quality of the proposal is really distinguished from past performance of the applicant. I'll show you here a table where we correlated the scores for the CV, so the past performance of the applicant with the scores of the for the quality of the project. And what we see here is that it's fairly high, especially in step one. So in our case, it's a two-step procedure, and in step one, it's 0.84, which in fact means that the reviewers do not distinguish really between the quality of the person, so the past performance, and the quality of the project. Okay, what then also influences grant success is the reputation of the applicant, which relates then to the number of international co-authors, the quality of the network of the applicants. For example, the ranking of the different organizations somebody has worked or collaborates with. And then also the journal prestige. So in the more higher impact journals you have published, the higher the probability that your grant application wins. Then there is quite a lot of bias which influences grant success. Cognitive proximity. So if your research topics are close to the topics of the of some of the panel members, that also seems to have a positive effect on the probability to win the grant, but this is not so clear whether that is always and overall the same. Then there is an effect of nepotism. Some of you may have noticed that recently we even got some attention for our study in Nature, as we showed in the paper, that if you apply in a panel where there is somebody from your institution in the panel, then the probability to get the grant is much higher than if this is not the case. And then there is gender bias. And we also showed in another paper that correlates strongly with several characteristics of the panel where the decision is made. And then finally, personal characteristics have an effect on the probability to win the grant. Age, for example, so the younger you are when you apply, the better it is. But on the other hand, the higher your academic age, which reflects your experience at the time you had to build up your expertise, that of course has a positive effect. And then we come to the topic of today. What about then the self-presentation? So which is also personal characteristic. How good can you present yourself? Here we always have the discussion, does this self-presentation then give more more reliable information apart from the, and I'm here talking about self-presentation in a face-to-face interaction, then only the written information provided to the panel? Or is it here stage performance that has an effect? As you may know, that if you go for a grant where there's an interview, especially in prestigious grants, a lot of universities now organize presentation training for the applicants in order to improve the presentation and also to increase the probability to win the grant. So in this face-to-face interaction, applicants present the proposal and then discuss with the panel. And we try to observe that, to investigate that using observations, but that is always very difficult to organize. And but here in the figure I now show the right side, you see on the horizontal axis the scores the applicants got in the second round before the interview and the discussion with the panel. So that's the horizontal axis. It goes from about 2.8 to 3.8. And on the vertical axis, you see the scores they get after the interview, which are only 3, 4, or 5. In total, 11 in this panel, 11 people got a grant, and which are at the right side, and the line in the middle now distinguishes those that score the highest, that were the highest 11 before the interview. And what we now see is that of these 11, only 7 in fact won the grant, and 4 new ones that were not high enough before the interview also won the grant, and 4 that were not that were in the top 11 before the interview did not end up after the interview. Now the question is, so they are indicated by the arrows in the downward direction, those that did not win in the end, and then the 4 that came into the top after the interview are indicated by the upward arrows. And now the question is this, then was this because the information they provided in the interview was so convincing that they these 4 positions changed so strongly, or is it because of the stage performance? Now, unfortunately, we were not able to observe the panels, and therefore we thought, let's try a next best solution and look at the self-presentation in the written documentation that applicants send to the council, and that then informs the panel. And that is the grant application. And the grant application in this case consists of 3 things. That is the abstract, that is the project description, and that is the CV of the applicant. I'll come back to the differences between the 3 later. Now, research on grant proposal text there are different strands. There's not much, but it's differentiated. So first, there's some literature on readability related to text characteristics. But then the question always pops up when you read these papers, why these characteristics then are those that should be taken into account. Generally, the studies show that these make the difference, but it's not always clear why these characteristics make the difference. Then there's some research on grant proposal as a genre, which focuses on the content elements that need to be, or that generally are in grant proposals, like stating the goal, describing the knowledge gap, showing competence of the applicant, etc. Then there's work on differences between disciplines. Is the style in different disciplines the same or not? How strongly is the need for an explicit argument, etc. Then there's literature that focuses on the context. So then the question is more, do grant proposals in scientific grant proposals and scientific articles share characteristics? And then there is some work on expectations of the readers. So that is partly what should be in the text that relates then to the previous point, the things I said about the genre, but it's also the question how then this should be presented in order to be convincing. And then there is an emerging literature that looks then not so much on the content of the presentation, so not on the content words in the application, but on the function words, which then define how the content is presented. And the idea is that the way authors use these function words, that shows competences, required competences, which then don't need to be explicitly be described. Finally, some remarks about the study. So most of these studies on grant proposal text are very small in the sense of the number of proposals that are studied and compared. And also it's often not real life. So for example, finding out how good proposals are is then done in a laboratory situation where students or researchers score the applications in terms of their readability or their quality. Now, there are a few exceptions, so I will refer to that also later, which is a study by Pennebaker, a psychologist who studied 10,000s of admission essays for American universities and then related the linguistic properties of these admission essays with the later grades those students got in their undergraduate studies, and there he found out that especially an analytic writing style, which reflects an analytic way of thinking, positively correlates with the grades these students later on receive in their examinations during their bachelor studies. And then Markovits, another psychologist, studied about 20,000 abstracts of grant applications, so that is only the very short text, in order to find out what linguistic characteristics of these grant applications then relate to not so much grant application success, because he only had successful abstracts of successful grant applications, but how that relates then to the amount of money people got for the grant. Now, our study has a few advantages. First, it's also large scale. We have about 3,000 application texts of granted and non-granted applicants in all scientific fields. It includes the abstract, the project description, and the CV. And we have native and non-native English speakers, which is also different from most of the other studies. Now, if you take a psychological approach here, like Pennebaker and Markovits did, then you approach the text in terms of a reflection of characteristics of the applicant. So the researcher who wrote the application And then Pennebaker, for example, argues that it's important, analytic thinking is an important property of researchers, and that analytic thinking here means that the focus is on objects of your study, and language does a lot distinguishing and specifying the question in terms of the objects and the conditions under what certain things happen. And then I'll come back also that in a minute. That leads then to specific linguistic characteristics of the application text. Markowitz has a little bit a broader perspective. He defines then a good application text in terms of that it should make clear that the author is able to write it up in a clear way, that the author is also able to think in a complex and analytical way about the topic of the proposal, and it should be written in a way that the reader gets the impression that, first of all, the author is confident that he or she can do the research proposed, but also that there is a confidence in the proposal itself, so that he or she is certain that this is a high quality, doable proposal. So in this way, the style of the text reflects cognitive competences and characteristics of the applicant. So here we see a little bit more in detail how this was operationalized by Markowitz and Pennebaker. So clear writing is then done in terms of a high score of common words. So that means that the application should be low on jargon, on technical. So the share of words that are technical should be relatively low. Complex analytic thinking means that the author uses long text, but not too long, and also long sentences, but not too long sentences, because writing in short sentences and writing short texts are perceived by readers as under complex way of presenting the research proposal. And the author should have a higher score on analytic writing, and I'll come back what that exactly means in a minute. And then the text should express self-confidence, and that means that it should have a high score on certainty terms and a low score on tentative terms. And finally, the confidence in the proposal should be reflected by a high score on causal terms. Now we will use this operationalization later in our empirical work, but what we also do there is controlling for English proficiency, because we have non-native speakers, and what we did is developing an indicator for based on nationality of English proficiency, but I won't go into that. And then finally, we will control in the analysis for the performance of the applicant, because some people may argue that if you're a good scientist, that you're also able to write it up very good. So then, if that is the case, then measuring the text quality or the writing style may be the same as measuring good science, and then we are not probably not explaining grand application success by presentation style, by writing style, but by the ability to do good science. And then what we will do in the future is controlling for gender, because it's clear in the literature that men and women tend to have different writing styles, and that may then, of course, influence in an indirect way grand application success. Okay, a few words about analytic thinking, so analytic thinking and analytic writing, as I already said, has a focus on objects and their comparison, and this means in terms of linguistic characteristics of an analytically written text is that there should be a high number of articles and prepositions in. And why is this the case? Many articles, because articles are always connected with nouns, and this reflects then the objects. And prepositions are typically words that situate the question in time and space, and and therefore also are expected to be very frequent in analytically written texts. And that what Pennebaker does, who introduced this concept, is contrasting it with discursive writing. So, and discursive writing, and I won't go into details here, is characterized by high shares of pronouns, conjunctions, negations, adverbs, and auxiliary verbs. And what he then does is creating a continuum, so a variable on where the one end, the high end, is analytic writing, and the low end is discursive writing. And then, so a high score on discursive writing means a low score on analytic writing. Here, for those who are not familiar with the different linguistic categories, this slide shows a few examples of the words typically used for the different variables included in our analysis. Okay, then let me say a few words about the case. Oh, sorry, this goes too quickly. So it's ERC starting grant. So there's a typo. It's not a 2004 round of the ERC starting grant because it doesn't exist in 2004. It's a 2014 starting grant, and it's the most prestigious grant for early career researchers in Europe. I would say you can apply for it up to 7 years after the PhD. It covers almost all fields. In total, in this year, there were 3,200 applicants, but 3,030 gave their informed consent. So we have data for almost everybody, and the success rate in the panels is low. It differs between 9% and 14%. And it's a two-step procedure. So in the first step, 3/4 of the applicants are rejected. And of the next 25%, of the next 25%, it goes to the second step where the interview also takes place. About half of them wins. What data do we use? We got the full grant proposal for all these applicants that gave informed consent. So for the 3,030, this is a PDF file, and for the analysis to do something with it, we had to convert it into text format, which is easy, but then we needed to do a lot of cleaning, because if you convert a PDF into text, there's a lot of characters that don't relate to the written text, but relate to the original formatting in the PDF file, which then has to be removed as good as possible. Then we split the text in an abstract part, the CV part, and the project description. And that is important because the results of a linguistic analysis may be different if you use different texts. And why is that the case? Because first of all, these texts have a different function, the abstract, the CV, and the project description. So that may then lead to differences in writing style. But they also have a different structure. For example, the CV nowadays contains many lists, although there is a tendency to ask in CVs also increasingly a more discursive part where applicants show their achievements in the past. Then we used a tool, the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count tool, which then processes the text documents and gives for and produces a spreadsheet with all the linguistic categories. It looks like this. You see then here in the first column is the word count. So you see this is the abstract because fairly short. It's a number. Then analytic is an analytic writing. This is an index between 1 and 0 and 100. So you see that everybody scores here pretty high. And then, for example, dictionary words. These are the common words, which is the percentage of non-technical terms in such a text. Okay, this is what we use in the analysis. This summarizes then again the model. So we have the independent variables that are all the linguistic categories, plus a few control variables, English proficiency and performance, which comes from partly from the CV, the performance, but also partly from Scopus, where we downloaded for each of these people their publications and derived from that some bibliometric indicators. And then as effect variables, we looked at the influence on scores, the panel gave for the project. Panelists gave then a score between 1 and 4. The final score, which is a 5-value score, and a decision, yes or no to step 2, and yes or no the grant in step 2. For time reasons, I think I don't go into this, but we used a few methods, mixed models regression, an ordinal regression, and a logistic regression. And then let me now go to the findings. So what we would have expected is that word count, as I already said, when I operationalize the different psychological variables into linguistic variables, word count and words per sentence, which reflect complexity, should have a positive effect on the, in this case, the scores the panel members give to the for the quality of the application. Word count squared and word per sentence squared should be negative, which means that if it becomes too long, then it's not effective anymore. Analytic thinking was expected to have a positive effect, as was the share of common words. And certainty terms too. Tentative terms was expected to be negative because that was then expected not to show the certainty, the self-confidence of the applicant. And then causal terms, which reflects the confidence in the proposal, should also be positive. And we would have expected that English proficiency works well and past performance. Now, if you now look at the found effects at the right side, we see that most of the hypotheses were confirmed, but that analytic thinking had a negative effect, so which means that a lower level of analytic thinking, so a higher level of discursive thinking and a discursive text would be positive. And also the share of common words had a negative effect, so more technical terms, in fact, works more positive. And tentative terms did not have an effect, which relates, and I don't think I have time to go into that, the tentative terms may have two functions in the text. Okay, we didn't do it then only for the...
Mr. Besseler, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But because we are running out of time and we have too many questions to answer, if you could just wrap up your...
Yeah, I'll do. Yeah, I'll go very fast now. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay, so we find in fact the same results for not only for the project score, but also for the final score and for the decisions. And when we looked then, and the previous one were all for the project text. So if you also looked at the abstract text and the CV, we found also similar results. And we also found that in step 2, the effects of the text disappear, which can easily be explained because then, of course, there's only a small set left, and then the text may be less influential because already everything is there considered to be very good. Okay, so overall the outcome is that word counts and word per sentence work positively, as do certainty and causal terms, but common words and analytic thinking, to our surprise, work negatively. This I may use a few seconds to discuss this. So this was an unexpected result, a lower level of analytic writing. And so we did a further analysis, and there we found that actually everybody scored very high on analytic writing. So it's not so much that it should be not so much analytic writing, but more narrative writing style, but it should be a combination. So you should be high on analytic writing, but then also the better your narrative is, also the higher the probability to get to receive the grants. And this I already and then this is issue 2. So we did not find that it's in fact the good scientist that has the good writing style, because in the model they don't replace for each other. Okay, so this is then the final conclusions. So you should have a text which is complex. strong analytically, but also has a good story, and it should have a strong technical content, and it should express a strong confidence in yourself and in the proposal. And then the implication is, of course, people may ask, so simply using these linguistic categories more, would that then improve your probability? But research shows, in fact, that that is not the case. So it's not that adding then these specific linguistic categories, so use more articles and prepositions, that improves the text. No, a good text has these properties. And then, of course, things come up. How would training and writing support help applicants? I'm not going into that because we're out of time. So then I stop now and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Besselar. It's been a great and a very interesting your presentation. We have too many questions. I don't know if we could answer all of them. We will answer as much as possible, and then if you allow us, we will share your email, and participants may reach you via email.
Yeah.
Okay. The first question: do you think that funding agencies are prepared to measure novelty? How we can measure novelty in a grant proposal?
Okay, this is a very difficult thing. So there is some literature, there are quite a few studies on, but I would say this is not very well developed yet. So I would think we don't know yet how to measure that, but also I would say that given the high correlation between the scores for the quality of the project with the quality of the CV of the applicant, I would argue that reviewers do not make this distinction very strongly. So that in fact, if you have a very good CV, your proposal is read with a much more positive viewpoint by reviewers. And if you have not so good CV, then they read it much more critically. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we would love to have an objective indicator for it, but that is a very difficult thing which is simply not solved.
Speaking about the CV, what about having a photo in the CV? Does it have a positive or a negative impact?
Okay, that's a very good question. I don't know. We did not look in that, but maybe I can have a look in the CVs and check whether there are photos in it. I don't know, but I don't remember. But we can check, and then whether that has an effect.
Okay. Another question, consultants are often involved in the writing of grant proposals. How did you take this into account in your studies, especially when linking the excellence of the scientist to the quality of the proposal?
Yeah, okay. This is a good issue. So we don't know. This is simply what we don't know. So this was one of the things I raised in the last slide. That somebody really write it him or herself. And so what we will do in the next round is having a proxy for that. So you may think that if you have an independent researcher who is independent of the supervisor, that somebody also may be more independent in writing things up him or herself. So what we are now doing is creating a variable what share of the publications, because we have the whole set of publications of all of the applicants, which set of the publications is not written with the PhD supervisor, because that gives then an indication about the independence of the researcher, which may be, we hope that can be generalized also to independence in writing. But it's also a lot of work, because then you have to find for 3,000 in the CVs the names of the supervisors, which are generally there, but not in a structured way.
Another question. I take it this is a case for proposals for the ERC. What about collaborative proposals, for example, EU strategic projects?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. So I would say we can only answer that if we would get a data set like this for an let's say a normal grant scheme where people together write a proposal which is not so much focusing on the individual career like in the ERC case, but which is more intended to solve a specific scientific problem. So this simply needs research. So the problem is that it's very difficult to get a data set where you get also the full text of the rejected proposals. And without having the rejected proposals, it's very difficult to do a study like this.
Okay, another question. Could you please give an example of function words?
Of function words?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So function words are the words that do not reflect content, but reflect the structure of the text. And so here you have the examples. So articles are a, n, and the. Prepositions are, for example, all, below, much, on top of, etc. Pronouns are, personal pronouns are I, us, we, you. And then you have the impersonal pronouns like it, this, and anything. Conjunctions are words that relate parts of the text, sentences, so and, so, until. Negations are no, never, not. So this is the list. So I think you will put somewhere the slide so people can have a look at it. And on my ResearchGate, there's also the paper that where this presentation is based on, so people can download it there.
Okay. What makes writing style more masculine or more feminine? Which style has more chances of winning?
Okay, so so you mean in relation to gender differences?
Most probably.
Yeah, so we don't know that. So that's what we will test in the next round. So where we will look whether how men and women differ in terms of the use of these linguistic categories that prove to be relevant for grant success. And so, but overall, that was in my last one of my last slides. So what you should have is a strong analytic writing style, but on top of that, writing a good story that can be followed, easily followed by the reviewers, without making it too simple, using short sentences and using avoiding technical terms, etc. Because then the reader doesn't believe that you're really a specialist in the field you're trying to get a grant for.
Okay, and one last question. Is this interesting study available?
Yes, the study is available on my ResearchGate page. So if you go there, then you can download the study. There's also the study on nepotism, so the interest representation, and one on gender bias. So for those who are interested in, all related to the same data set, this ERC 2014 round of the starting grant, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Besseler. It was a pleasure having you with us. And I propose we move on to our next keynote speaker, Jan Andersen. Jan is a senior executive advisor at the University of Southern Denmark. He's also one of the founders and the first chair of BESTPRAC and former EARMA chair. Today, he will speak about soft skills for RMAs and their effective influence in your organization, despite that we have no formal power. Over to Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the whole BESTPRAC community and EARMA to invite me to this event. I think that I can promise that I will not be very analytical in the approach to the next topic. I will share my presentation. As already mentioned, I'm a senior executive advisor at the University of Southern Denmark, and I'm going to talk a little bit about soft skills for RMAs. How can you influence your organization without formal powers? And I'll just say a few seconds about my university. We are only for 4,000 employees and with around 26,000 students. So we are a small university, and we are placed in Odense, in the center of Denmark, but we have campuses all over Denmark. And here is the organization of my institution. As you can see, it looks like, I think, all other university organizations diagrams that you have seen. So we have a board, a rectorate, a number of faculties with a number of departments, and then there is a central administration. So it's an extremely simple structure. But I will come back to that a little bit later because it looks like very simple on the front page, but when you dive into it, it turns out to be a little bit more tricky than that. So I have a master degree in computer science and Danish language, but I have been working with within the administration and research management and research support throughout my whole career, from 1994 to now the University of Southern Denmark in 2020. I've been working with University of Copenhagen Faculty of Science, but also in Rector's office, and I had different cross-cutting positions and functions. Then I was invited to set up research support at the Technical University of Denmark, and then I moved in 2020 to University of Southern Denmark. Beside being a research manager and administrator, I have been active in the society or the community of research managers and administrators, and been involved in the setting up of a number of networks. The Danish EU network. I was chair of BESTPRAC and one of the initiative takers behind BESTPRAC. I was the chair of EARMA for a number of years and a board member of EARMA. And I was also one of the founders of the Danish Association for Research Managers and Administrators. And as you can see, I have marked some of these events with I hope it's a star, but that was at least the intention. Just to say that many of these activities, they are started because there was a gap. One of my first projects within the university was a project on lifelong learning, because it turned out that the university did not have any relevant offers, and there was a lot of stakeholders outside university wanting to become involved in further education within the university, and based on that, we started up a small project with a number of collaboration partners. Our university, or the University of Copenhagen, had an old research information system that was that should be renewed, and I suggested that instead of just having a library system, I suggested that it should be a real research information system with a lot of functionalities that could help not only the monitoring of research, but also the institution and the documentation on how research performance is not only linked to publications, but also research project, research outcomes, patents, and so on. And that turned into a nice project that established what is called CURIS, but now is is better known in the world as PURE. So many of you will know PURE as your institution's research information system. And we started that at University of Copenhagen back in the, I think, the beginning of 2000 something. Also, the establishing of BESTPRAC and my activities in Denmark was based because there was a gap between what was existing and what was needed, so to speak. So in that sense, I'll try to turn that into a better understanding of what does it actually mean to be an active, engaged person in the university without necessarily having the formal power. All the projects that I've shown in the previous slides was actually taken without any other formality in it. That I started identifying a problem, talked about it with colleagues, and then started to try to see how could we actually overcome and solve that gap. How could we solve that problem? And the gap is coming from something that's not functioning, or is ineffective, or is missing. So the second column here, the Y column, is the one that actually defines where is your room for making changes. And then of course you will identify those gaps by having a critical approach to your work, or to what you are doing, or what you see in your surroundings. But that critical approach could be turned into something negative, or being a pedantic person that's criticizing everything. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that it's a process where we actually have to be looking at things in a positive way, so that the critics is not a critics for critics' sakes, but because we want to improve the situation on this topic. And then you have to move over to understand the problem. And here's the only analytical bit we have, more or less. I think there's one or two more, but you have to understand what is actually the problem. What is its content? What are the framework conditions for the problem? And what are your opportunities to change things? And here, very often details can be crucial. So don't jump over to conclusions in the analytical phase. Then you need to understand where do you want to go, and I'm going to give a practical example in a few seconds. You want to understand where should this actually lead, and that very often means that you will actually have to go out and listen to other people, and the people who have ideas from outside. You have to involve stakeholders who can actually take the decision on changes, but also who can give input to the process that you are planning. And my major view on this is that I'm always looking for having a critical, negative person who is resistant to change in the project, because they will actually be the ones who ask the critical questions to your vision or your new idea. So this mapping of stakeholders is extremely important. Of course, manage up, understand who takes the decision, and also what is the resistance towards to the decisions. And of course, you have to follow the rules the formal rules, and as I put in brackets when it's necessary, because sometimes rules are there without a very good reason, and you have to understand where can you actually push the rules and understand how you can use the rules for your own benefit. All this has to do with that what you are proposing should have a bottom line, and you have to have an outcome that's explainable and beneficial for users. You have to have a documentation of your process because you basically want to cover your ass in case everything goes wrong, and that is why I say you have to follow the rules, because following the rules and document it is also important when things go wrong. Then it's everything about at least what I've been doing. Maybe someone will come up with more abstract proposals, but I've always been a very practical person. So everything what I've done has been oriented towards finding practical solutions. Then I have mentioned something about risk, understand the boundaries of your projects, and then finally kill your darlings. Don't go with everything just because you can, but maybe you should be aware that you have to be also willing to take a defeat or a failure. So now I'm just going to give very briefly a short example. It's a project that I've started here at the University of Southern Denmark. It's about responsible research and innovation. Basically, my motivation is that there are some kind of formal demand from the outside to have a focus on responsible research and innovation, primarily from external funders. I think that it could be a competitive advantage for the university to have a structured approach to this. And I can see that a lot of researchers, they are struggling with what should they do and how should they do it in their daily practice as researchers. So the idea here is actually to take all the components of responsible research. I think I've mentioned not everything, but most of it here. And for each of these components, describe what is the policy of the institutions that's underlining these different steps, and then an administrative side describing how is this linked together with practices, for example, in data management, cloud services, open science services, or guidelines on ethics, gender, and so on. I showed you before that we have a central administration, and many of these things could actually be, the decision on the policy side could be done in the rectorate, maybe in the board of the directors, and then by the administration. But when you look at it, the central administration and the policy is much more than just one dot. There's a lot of different actors in the process. So it's a communication department, it's a research and innovation department, it's rectors and deans, it's rector's office, it's the library who have a huge say in this, it's IT. So there are different forces that will have to be linked together, different stakeholders that have to see their own value for money in this process. And just to give an example, for instance, our communication department, they are extremely effective and very nice. I think we have a nice website, but it's all towards future students and to recruit students, and they don't have a lot of interest in supporting these types of more policy and abstract oriented processes. Everybody will say, oh, we are already doing a lot, so we don't have to do more. And So in this process, it's important to define who has the ownership of this project. Where is the commitment of the involved partners, and what is nice to have and what is a need to have. And I think there will be a lot of nice tools that will have to be cut in order to make it resource balanced. So what looks as a simple central administration thing can turn out to be a very complicated process of different stakeholders fighting for their own resources and against each other. So that was a very short introduction to how can you work within your institution as an individual person. I think the most important thing here is like what you're doing, have fun. You should of course join EARMA, and you should also follow BESTPRAC. So now over if there are any questions.
Thank you, Jean, for this great presentation. We actually have one question. Do you have a problem finding persons with adequate education and mention personal soft skills in Denmark?
Say it again.
Do you have a problem finding persons with adequate education and soft skills in Denmark?
I don't really understand the question. I mean, soft skills is something.
Is it easy for you to find, I think from what I read, is it easy for you to find RMAs? Most probably with adequate education and soft skills.
Oh, okay. No, I don't think so. I think that many of the problems, or what you could say, the challenges that ends up with these with soft skills is that there can be a risk adverseness in people, that they are afraid of taking risks in their institutions, or they don't have the frame to take risks. So they feel uncomfortable in taking risks.
So in Denmark, you do find RMAs with soft skills and adequate education.
I think yes, but I think all have soft skills, so to speak. So it's not. I just what I think is it's underrated, and I don't think that's only in Denmark. I think it's globally that it's not very well recognized, and I think that it's not very well nurtured in the way that we work. So I would definitely think that we should do more to promote soft skills and give training in soft skills, because it is an important issue if you want to change things, and I want to change things to the better. So.
Okay, and the one last question, Jan, before we break: has the organization structure a major impact on influence?
Yes, definitely. What I have seen when I was employed in my university, I was employed as one of the first RMAs in Denmark, and I really didn't understand what the work was about. I mean, I could understand the words that was written in the paper, but it wasn't really clear for me what it was about. And after some days I've been looking at this on my first days at the job. I went to my boss and said, I can see the words here, I can see what you have written, but I don't really understand what it means, what I'm supposed to do, because there was no colleagues in my field. And he said, that is why we hired you, to find out. So in that sense, to being a research manager and administrator for 20 years ago was more like an academic endeavor, where we have to try to find new ways and new paths. But we have moved into much more structured universities with limited resources, with a higher specialization of staff, And that means that this broad understanding of RMA as an academic endeavor where you can go in different directions and try different things has definitely been reduced, and there's really high what you can say bottom line focus from institutions that we can see the discussion on KPIs, how many applications are you sending in, how is your success rate, and so on.
There is one more question. I think we can take this one as well. What are the main soft skills necessary for RMAs in your opinion?
Basically, I think it's the willingness to take risk, and then it is humor. I know I just think that that being able to take a light look at life is extremely important, because we have success rate of down to between 10 and maybe 15% if we are lucky, and that means that if we shouldn't be able to carry that weight of 90% discouraging rejections, we are going to have a hard life. So.
Thank you, Jan. I propose we break here and come back in at 10:15. So you can take a few minutes to stretch and grab a cup of coffee. So see you all at 10:15. So welcome back, everybody. We will move on with our next keynote speaker, Sylvia McCarthy. Sylvia is an EU policy analyst at Hyperion Limited. Based in Brussels since 2008, Sylvia has worked in the European Parliament and various EU consultancies and representations. Sylvia has a bachelor's degree in European Studies and a master's degree in International Politics and Europe. Sylvia will make a presentation on who wrote the topics in Pillar 2. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And good morning, everybody. Now, I am, just to warn you, I'm leaving my window open because it's quite warm, but we have Mr. Biden and Mr. Trudeau in town today in Brussels. So there's a lot of helicopters, so hopefully it won't be too noisy. So yes, I'm Hyperion's EU policy analyst, and anyone who hasn't met me before, but who has met Sean, yes, indeed, I am his daughter. And he sends his regards to you. So I'm going to be speaking about who wrote the topics. And this is something that I work on a daily basis in Hyperion. So this is why I'm best placed to speak about it. So we look at, first of all, how EU policies lead to Pillar 2 topics, then analysing a work programme, which sounds basic, but there's a trick to it. Then the expert groups that are consulted for Pillar 2 topics, CSAs, which are absolutely crucial for European Commission foresight and also your own foresight and strategic opportunities. And then finally, what is proposal intelligence and what does it look like for Pillar 2 topics? So you're all very familiar with the structure of Horizon Europe. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I just want to show you how we come at it from Hyperion, because Pillar 2 is such an important pillar for us in the upcoming program. So Pillar 1 is about excellent science, establishing the EU as a scientific leader. That's, of course, where you find your ERC, your Marie Curie, and research infrastructures. Pillar 2, where our main focus is, we want to know what are the global challenges and how the EU can become an industrial leader. These are where we find the clusters, the JRC, and of course, the missions, which I'll be coming to a little later on. Pillar 3, Innovative Europe, establishing the EU as a leader in innovative companies. And that's where we find EIC, the innovative ecosystems, and EIT. And then, of course, there's the widening participation and strengthening the European research area. Now, why did I outline that today when we're not going to be talking about all of these areas? I just want to emphasize that these pillars are bottom up. You're free to submit any idea, whether it's on excellent science or excellent innovation, but it's not something that we can deal with because we're focused on the top-down pillars. We want to know what are the specific EU policies that have led to these clusters, these destinations, these topics being included in Horizon Europe. And that's where who wrote the topic comes into play. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Hyperion triangle. Up here you have the politicians. These are the heads of state, the council, the ministers, the MEPs. Most of them aren't scientific experts. Most of them aren't even political experts. From Ireland, we used to have an MEP who was a former Eurovision winner. So that's the kind of mindset of the politicians. They're thinking about elections. They're thinking about the mark they're going to leave on their national and European politics. Then you have the European Commission. These are the officials, the bureaucrats who draft huge policy papers, such as the work programs for Horizon Europe. And then down here you have the researchers. And it's all about how these are balanced against each other. So if we take a policy such as Horizon Europe, it's created at this level between the politicians and the European Commission. The strategic phase for Horizon Europe was during 2017 to 2019, where there were lots of discussions and high-level conferences on what the priorities would be. Then this was passed on to the European Commission for the program planning phase, which was in the last 2 years. And there was a lot of back and forth with the budget and so on, but it was still always being worked on by the Commission, by the relevant Directorate Generals in the European Commission. And finally, we have still only draft work programs, but Horizon Europe is formed and is ready to go. And the funding that comes from Horizon Europe will be passed on to the researchers, and then the researchers will have their own opportunity to have an impact on EU policymaking, whether it's with their research or with their involvement in various expert groups. This is where proposal intelligence comes in. When I'm doing a proposal intelligence report, or I'm addressing a group of researchers or support staff such as yourselves, this is what I want to know. I want to know, what are the EU policies that have defined the cluster? Why is that cluster included in Horizon Europe? I want to know, what are the destinations, the sections, the calls, the topics, and what are the specific policies that have defined their existence? Then I want to know which expert groups have been consulted by the Commission in the development of the work programs. And finally, what are the previous projects that have been funded? And here especially I want to look at coordination and support actions. The previous projects will give me an idea of the portfolio of projects, what gaps exist, what bottlenecks exist, but the CSAs are going to be so interesting. So I hope you stick around for that section. So on to analyzing a work program. Now this sounds basic, but I want you to bear with me. First of all, we have to know the language of the work program. The language of the work program, the language of Horizon Europe, is the language of the politicians. All right. So that means that we have to know about the challenges and opportunities that shape those policies that are being developed by the politicians. For example, we have the Commission priorities. At the moment, under the current Commission president, we have 6 priorities. They're very broad: a European Green Deal, a Europe fit for the digital age. They're you have to think of them as umbrella terms. Underneath those priorities, there are specific policy areas. So if we take a European Green Deal, which sounds so European and so vague, under that we have biodiversity, marine, we have clean energy, we have circular economy, more specific policy areas, and it gives you a better idea of what the Commission wants from this particular priority. Similarly, a Europe fit for the digital age, artificial intelligence, big data, high performance computing, that's where all of those policy areas fit in. So it just requires a little extra knowledge. Then we have the mission areas. I'll be looking at these in a little more detail later on. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, these are the guiding light for policy making at EU level. And then the Paris Agreement is all about climate change. And then we look at the opportunities. These are the opportunities for the EU to become an industrial leader. And that ties back to the priorities for Pillar 2, of course. An international cooperation, Europe to become a global actor, to lead on international cooperation. And that links up with this particular priority down here, a stronger Europe in the world. So there's constantly references back to the Commission priorities, the Sustainable Development Goals throughout the work programs. So let's take the Sustainable Development Goals as an example. And here I've taken Goal 3, Target 4, which is about mortality from non-communicable diseases, mental health and well-being. And when we look at Cluster 1 on health, Destination 3, and the expected impacts, that language is being used there. We see mortality from non-communicable diseases, mental health and well-being. So that means that when we look at the topics under that destination and say someone is working on a proposal on non-communicable diseases, risk reduction in adolescents and youth, they're going to need to know that this all comes from that original Goal 3, Target 4. That's who wrote this particular topic, or that's one of the areas that wrote that particular topic. So this really means that we need to know how to read the work program. Now, the example I have today is Cluster 2 on culture, creativity, and inclusive society. This particular work program, it's only 180 pages long. Cluster 6 is, I think, 550 pages long. Your researchers aren't going to want to read every single page. They're going to want to find the topic, say on cultural heritage and arts or the new European Bauhaus, and say, oh, that's for me. I'm going straight to those 2 pages. I don't need to read anything else. You need to emphasize that if they're skipping the introduction to the cluster, they're missing out on the main policies behind the cluster. That is the reason for the cluster being included. If they skip the introduction to the destination, they're missing out on the specific policies and the expected impacts. The Commission is providing all of this information. I think it's the first time that they're actually providing bullet points on what they are looking for from the proposals within the specific destinations. And that requires that little bit of reading. And then, of course, within the topic, you have the scope of the topic and the expected outcomes, and the proposal, including the outputs, are submitted at topic level. But look at the wealth of information behind that. And here I want to just highlight again the CSAs. Sometimes they're being actually included in the table of contents. You can go down through it and pick out the CSAs, and that's very important for the Commission. So let's look at that block of text from Cluster 2 for the introduction. It looks blah, blah at first glance. But for me and for anyone reading it in a little more detail, there are words and phrases that jump out that you know that there are policies behind them. Democratic governance, citizens' participation, cultural heritage, cultural transformations, European green and digital transition and recovery. So that's all coming into this culture and creativity. Then, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. And look at this. They're actually telling you which goals they want to address. So even if your researchers just went to those Sustainable Development Goals and those targets, they would know, they would have such a fuller picture of the Commission priorities in this particular cluster. Then onto the destination, cultural heritage, monuments and sites, creative diversity, and so on. These are the crucial phrases that are jumping out. And then it gets more specific as you go along. And finally, onto the topic. And you would assume that this would be where the researcher, it's completely research language. But when I was looking through this particular topic, I saw our way of life. So a European way of life is one of the priorities for the Commission. So then I would have to know what they are talking about there, and promoting Europe's place in the world. So this topic is specifically referring back to those priorities in detail: diversity, creative approaches, and increased competitiveness. So it's all relevant, and it all requires that little bit of intelligence. And then, of course, you have your expected impact for Cluster 2 Destination 2 topics, and that refers to the Horizon Europe Strategic Plan. And then look at these lovely bullet points for the expected outcomes of that particular topic. So it sounds basic, but there's a way of reading the work program to make it relevant to the researcher. And then we can move on to the expert groups. Now, there are different types of expert groups that are consulted by the Commission. You have to remember the Commission, as I said, it's made up of civil servants, of bureaucrats. They're wonderful at what they do, drafting these huge work programs, these massive proposals, but they need support. They need scientific expertise when they're drafting them. So they look to technology expert groups for information in the form of strategic research and innovation agendas or roadmaps. They look for reports or position papers. They look for conferences maybe that are being held by the EIPs, for example, and they look at what's being done by the CSAs. And now we will have the mission boards and the mission areas to look at. So these are expert groups. They provide information to the Commission. They're consulted by the Commission, but they're also a really good source of potential partners. So that's what you have to have on your mind the whole time while you're looking at different lists of expert groups. So I'm first going to go to the KETs, the Key Enabling Technologies. These are platforms. They are identified by the Commission. And these particular ones are for Horizon Europe. These two at the bottom, artificial intelligence and digital security and connectivity, they're brand new. They're brand new kits as a result of this high-level group on refinding industry. They identified that these needed to be looked at in more detail. In more detail. And then this life sciences technologies, it used to be biotechnology, but again, this high level group said biotechnologies, it's too specific. We need to broaden the scope. So the SRIAs, the strategic research and innovation agendas that come from these kits are used by the Commission in the development of the relevant work programs. Then we look at the technology and innovation platforms. Now, the examples I've taken today are just energy platforms, but there are plenty of others. There's ICT, there's biodiversity, and so on. So you need to know that you're either on one of these platforms, your researchers are on these platforms, that they know exactly what's coming out of them. And again, coming out of these are reports, SRAAs, roadmaps, making everything as clear as possible for the Commission. They identify the knowledge that's needed, the areas where Europe can be more competitive, and these particular platforms are industry-led. They're for all stakeholders, but they're led by industry, and they're greatly respected by the Commission for their knowledge. Finally, on to the European Innovation Partnerships. There are now 4 of these partnerships, and they bring together public and private stakeholders. They're think tanks, essentially, that are used by the Commission to identify gaps and bottlenecks. And they change on a regular basis, their focus areas, their thematic groups. And for example, the smart cities and communities is really focused on urban mobility and smart lighting, for example. And they're a really good source of information for the Commission, but again, for you, they're sources of potential partners, and definitely worth a look if you're not already involved in one of them. So with that knowledge, we can move on to the CSAs, coordination and support actions. So these, we would consider them to fall under the societal challenges side of things. They are funded by Horizon Europe, by Horizon 2020 in the past, but they don't fund research. They fund these actions. They could be the organization of a conference, the development of a network of experts, for example, a standardization effort. And the Commission sees that if they fund a CSA on a short-term basis, so for example, there's a few of them that are only 1.5 to 2 years long, but they're funded and encouraged to produce a roadmap. And with that roadmap, the Commission can justify including that area as a topic in a future work program. And this is what I mean. I have a few nice examples here that should hit a few different clusters. This is a CSA that was funded in Horizon 2020 under FET. It's called Humane AI. It's about empowering people with artificial intelligence and extending their intelligence. The roadmap that led from this CSA in Horizon 2020 contributed to this topic in Cluster 4 of Horizon Europe, Artificial Intelligence for Human Empowerment. So if I was to do a proposal intelligence report on that particular topic, and I was asked who wrote this topic, I would have to refer back to this particular CSA. And this is not something that's hugely apparent. It requires a certain amount of reading and going back through the Cordis database and comparing and contrasting language and so on. But when it jumps out like this, when it's very clear that this topic has led, it comes from this roadmap, from this CSA, it's so much clearer as to where the Commission is coming from. So these CSAs, they give you an insight into the Commission, but they also give you a strategic opportunity to create future work programs. So they're strategic for you, they're strategic for your researchers, and they're foresight opportunities for the Commission. The Commission loves foresight. There's even a commissioner for foresight. They need to know what's coming up down the line. And this is one way of doing that. So here are another few ideas. These are two more from FET on natural photosynthesis and converting solar and wind energy into chemical forms. And here we have Cluster 5 topics on artificial photosynthesis and renewable energy for the chemical industry. Direct link-ups. Again, here, these are on spatial planning and Arctic ice. And here we have land use for climate change and polar processes for climate change. So there are links. And can you imagine if you or your researchers were looking at a topic and you were able to say, we wrote that topic, we were the ones, our consortium worked together, we created a roadmap and we wrote that topic. So CSAs, researchers are turned away from them because they don't fund research and because there's not a huge amount of money in them, if that's a priority. But that's how you convince a researcher or a head of department that this is crucial, because a CSA is going to be worth so much more down the line. And if a commission introduces a CSA, there has to be a reason behind it. So with that, we can move on to the mission areas. And there's a link up between the CSAs and the mission areas. We've heard a lot about these missions in the last few years. Now we know that there are 5: cancer, climate change, healthy oceans, smart cities, soil health. Those 5 are constantly repeating in my head. Then we know about who's on the mission board and who's involved in the mission assemblies. We've seen the reports that were presented to the commissioner last year on the different mission areas. And these mission boards are asked to advise on the characteristics of project portfolios. Again, those portfolios of projects, what has been funded, what is funded, what needs to be funded. And they identify priority research areas where gaps exist. The commission wants to be innovative, they want to be forward-looking, but they also want to fill in any problem areas. And so in the last couple of months, we've seen the draft work programs for the mission areas, and voila, it turns out they're all CSAs. So with that knowledge of CSAs behind us, we know that these are going to be topics in future work programs, or they may indeed be future work programs in themselves. So if your researchers, if your organization is involved in the cancer research area, mission area, for example, now, you're shaping a future work program. You're going to be first and foremost at that work program in 2027. So it's an investment for you and it's an investment for the commission. And it's something that it's going to be on our minds for a long time. And with that, then we can move on to proposal intelligence. Now, I've said it already, this is where I do my work on a daily basis, finding out who wrote the topic. And there's a reason for this because of what I said earlier, impact. If we know who wrote the topic, we know who wrote, we know where the impact is going. So this is what I mean. This is an ideal, this is an example for a general cancer research proposal. It's very short, it's just one slide. If I was to go into it in more detail, it could obviously be very, very long. Cancer is such a broad area. I did a report in the last few weeks, I think it was about 10 pages long, looking at a specific topic on cancer research. But these are the key policies So no proposal on cancer would be missing Sustainable Development Goal 3 and the relevant target within there. They would be mad to miss out on Europe's Beating Cancer plan. That's the guiding light for anything on cancer. And of course, the Joint Research Centre and the Cancer Information System is going to be crucial. Then we want to know, who are the cancer experts? Who has been consulted by the Commission? Who has been involved in conferences? Who has submitted consultations? These are the different cancer associations that are going to be most involved in a proposal in this area. And then we look at the portfolio of projects. We go to the Cordis database. If you type in cancer, you're going to get thousands of previously funded projects. But when you get more specific on a particular type of cancer or a particular type of screening or diagnostic, you're going to get a better picture of what has already been funded. So this can be done for any, this type of intelligence can be done for any topic, any destination. In fact, it just gets a bit more detailed when you get to that level. Artificial intelligence is another one that I have an example for today. You have your priorities, your strategies, the report from the Joint Research Centre, the relevant Sustainable Development Goal, then the artificial intelligence expert groups. When I look at these, I'm going to want to know who's on that high level group. I want to know who's involved in the European Artificial Intelligence Alliance. They're all going to be ideal partners for a proposal in this area. And then looking again at the portfolio of projects, what has already been funded. And the last example I have is about marine ecosystems. So this would fit into cluster 6, for example. Here are your policies. Here are your expert groups. This is actually a nice mixture of the JPIs versus the European Marine Board or the Coastal and Marine Union. So a mixture between public and private stakeholders, and then the portfolio of projects. So you could use this just for information for researchers, but if a researcher came to you to convince you that their proposal was worth working on, and they produced a slide like this for you as a screening process, you'd know that they understood this concept of proposal intelligence and who wrote the topic. Because when we come to the conclusions, it all leads to impact. So pillar 2, we've already said, excellent science, which is used to address global challenges and establishing the EU as an industrial leader. That's what the Commission wants. And that's why those topics address specific EU policies. But with that knowledge, you can lead on to impact, because that means that you can begin the proposal with impact on specific EU policies. Your researchers will appreciate that the background to a topic is relevant to impact on those specific EU policies. But I want to finish on this because it's so important, and it's something that keeps coming up. This all depends on excellent science. The science that your researcher is giving us has to be 5 out of 5, all right? You support staff can provide support on so many levels, but you need them to provide the excellent science. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. My contact information is there. I see there's a few questions already, so we have plenty of time for answering questions, or if you have any arguments you want to give me. The presentation will be available to circulate afterwards, and if anyone is interested in seeing a couple of reports so that you could prepare them yourselves for your researchers, please get in touch. And I'll hand back to you now, Andrew, if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Thank you, Sylvia, for this excellent, very detailed and explanatory presentation. We do have many questions. First question, if you coordinate the coordination and support action, what would you need to do to make into a topic in the work program? This needs some work, right?
Yes, and the problem is that it's not very apparent. It's only recently that it's becoming very clear to us that that's where it's coming from. But Sean had an example. He was working with UCC, actually, the university in Cork that I went to. And he was talking about CSAs. He was explaining to them that the Commission is using them for foresight. And a person there who was actually coordinating a CSA said, oh my God, it makes so much more sense now. We're working on this CSA, and this huge research center from France contacted us, and they made it sound like they were doing us a favor. They were saying, oh, we'll coordinate it for you. It's no problem. We've got plenty of people. We'll do that hard work for you, and you can focus on every other part of it. And it was then that you realized they wanted it because they knew they'd be writing the topic. So it's a foresight opportunity, and it just means you have to just read those work programs in a little more detail. I'm already starting to scan for CSAs now and seeing how they will work out in the future. But it just means that don't disregard the CSAs. That's what I'm saying, because when you look at them monetarily, it's the difference between a €1 million project and a €22 million project, but that €1 million is investment money. It's going towards the future. So it's not a guarantee, but it's a probability. So I know that's kind of hard to say. It's not a specific answer to your question, but it just justifies why you would submit a proposal on a CSA. Okay. There's some more?
Yes. Many policymakers and organizations are busy in your triangle. Where do RMAs fit?
RMAs are, you're supporting the researchers. So if the researchers are down here, you're that little nice bubble around them, giving them the information in a very clear way. All right. So you're almost acting like someone who's translating the work of the Commission for the researchers and making it clear where they fit in, and holding their hand and making them not be afraid of that policy language, just showing them how it fits into their research and how their research fits into the policy.
True. What are the typical changes between Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe with regards to influencing, besides a different definition of impact?
By influencing, do you mean the influence of these expert groups, maybe? If so, I would see the expert groups as getting a lot more respect from the Commission, but also from the researchers, because if researchers are encouraged to be involved in expert groups, then they'll respect where the information is going, and the Commission uses those expert groups. And you just have to think it's the power of unity, the power of a group going to a meeting here in Brussels or organizing a meeting here in Brussels. It's just that bit stronger than an individual. If you have the support of your peers from different countries, from different forms of industry, different stakeholders, it just shows a unified approach on particular gaps and bottlenecks.
Another question, are the members of technical expert groups consulted by the EU listed somewhere?
Yes. Before we finish here, I'll post a link that we have. This is to do with, this is the one now. Yes. This is for our proposal, the Hyperion proposal course. You'll get some links here. I'll just put it down here for all panelists and attendees. This will give you a starting point, but you need to look for example, the KETs, for example, the technology platforms. They're not all listed in one place. However, the Commission does have its register of expert groups, of high-level groups, and there you would get a lot of information. And that's one of the places that I go to first to see who are the different stakeholders being represented on different areas. So it's not all in one place, unfortunately. There's some digging, as always, some digging involved.
True. So our next question, how do you team up to promote a particular topic or approach? National researchers organization relationship with EC policy officer in charge, or?
There are different ways. Being involved in an expert group, of course, being aware of what conferences are taking place. I know that's a bit harder. Well, in the last year, it's been harder, but everything is online now. So if I wanted to find out which particular commission official was interested in a particular topic, I would just go find a conference and see which commission officials attended. That's the first starting point for me. And I'd say, okay, they're in that unit. Who else in that unit is involved in this area? And it just gives you, it just makes things a little smaller. When you think of the European Commission and the thousands of officials there, then you narrow it down to the correct Director General, the correct unit, the specific official. It just becomes much more manageable and digestible when you break it down a little bit like that. It's less of a dear European Commission. It's more dear Mr. whatever. It's much more manageable in that way.
Okay, next question. Why are the cross references not specifically mentioned in the topic text? It will be much easier to know which exact EU priorities and policies one has to read in addition, instead of having to go through all of those policy papers, goals, etc., and see which ones fits to the call. Yeah,
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's all about length. That example I gave of cluster 2, it's one of the shortest work programs and still 180 pages long. So we should, in a way, we should just be grateful that they're providing so much information in the work program already. There's a reason why they only provide certain information in the introduction and certain information to the introduction to the destination, because if they repeated it over and over and over in each of the topics, it would be thousands of pages long. So they are, in fairness to them, in fairness to the Commission, they are being extremely consistent. They are providing so much information about the Sustainable Development Goals. They have loads of footnotes in the clusters, in the cluster introduction and the destinations. They're providing as much information that is manageable. But imagine if you had to open a 2,000-page document every time you wanted to find your topic, it would be even more off-putting. So we have to be patient with them. They are giving us as much information as possible.
Next question, what are your thoughts on competing for a research and innovation action or an innovation action that is the next step for a CSA or low TRL research innovation action already funded? Should you try to join them and give up if you are not invited?
I mean, there is the hop-on opportunity in Horizon Europe. I wouldn't join just because it's a potential CSA. I would watch and see what comes out of it. I would see what they produce. Obviously, if your work is going to be relevant to their work and you think you can contribute to it, yes, get involved and ask if you can join. But if you're just joining to be involved in a future CSA, that's a little bit of a motive that I don't think they're going to be too happy about.
Okay. If you participate in writing the topic, how can you then be eligible for applying for the grant?
Oh, you can. I mean, it's a different program. Like we actually had someone on a course recently, and we were talking about another FET topic it's called Time Machine. And it's about artificial intelligence and big data mixed with cultural heritage and history. And that's an example that I use in the courses. And I was showing how it linked to a particular topic in cluster 2. And there was someone on the course who was involved in that Time Machine project. And when she was working on the CSA, she didn't know she was writing a topic. It wasn't the motive behind this CSA. But when she actually saw them compared, she said, yes, we wrote that topic. So she could just as easily apply to be involved in the topic in Horizon Europe, even though she was involved in the Time Machine project. It's how the Commission uses the outcomes of these CSAs. And it's just something that we have to be more and more mindful of when we're talking about CSAs in the future.
If you write the CSA now, could there be the risk that in 7 years your research or research field has changed?
I'm sure there is. There's so much change, and there's so many changing priorities within the Commission, of course, but that I think that's more up to you and your research than the Commission. The Commission isn't going to be focusing on that. They're going to be focusing on their own priorities.
How much are proposal reviewers informed of the EU policies? Does the language communicate well with them?
The reviewers, it depends. Okay, if it's a scientific evaluator, they don't know anything about them. They would know very little about the policy areas. So that's why you have to educate them. So you're educating the evaluator. But when your proposal gets to the committee level, the committee level is made up of Commission officials. So they are the policy experts. So when you're writing your proposal, you're constantly thinking, I'm educating the evaluator, but I'm alerting the committee official or the Commission official to the relevance of my proposal to policy. So you're having to adapt in a certain way to two different types of expert, a policy expert and a scientific expert. And as regards the language, this is where we called for an impact partner, someone who speaks the language of the researcher, the scientist, but also the language of the institution. So that's why we actually say that the impact section should be written by the impact partner, because they almost act like a translator between both sides.
And the last question, does it make sense to prepare for a call topic, for example, human, as already proposals have been circulated by EARMA long before the first draft of calls have been known? How to compete with consortia which wrote these topics?
You can still write a fantastic proposal. Just because these expert groups essentially wrote the topic, that doesn't mean that they're going to be funded. That just means that they were part of a really good expert group that communicated well to the Commission that these are essential areas. It doesn't mean that they're going to be funded. It means they have a little advantage. But your science, your excellent science, combined with excellent impact, it has just as much chance as anyone else. And it's all about being informed. So you might not be on an expert group, you might not be involved in the consortium that wrote the topic, but you understand just as much as them. So I wouldn't give up in the face of that by any means, because nothing is certain. They could easily fall when it comes to the evaluator, and your impact and excellent science is what brings you forward.
Thank you, Sylvia. It was a pleasure having you with us today.
My pleasure.
Johanna?
Yes, from my side as well. Thank you very much, Sylvia, for your excellent presentation and for answering all the many questions.
Yes, I was glad I finished a little early.
Yes.
And if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to speak to you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The rest of the day goes well, and I have to go to another course now in Ireland.
Oh, wow. A good day to you too.
I hope the event goes very well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Then for everyone, we are now leaving the plenary session, this webinar, and we will move into our working groups like yesterday. So today we don't have working group 3, but working group 1 and 2. You've already received the links, and I also just reposted them on the chat. So you can check there or in your emails. And we have a mini break. Well, now only 3 minutes left, because we would like to start the working groups at 11. So I suggest you immediately try to get into your working group, and we'll see you there. Just for you to know, today we are not coming back to this webinar, so I will close this webinar in a second. And the meeting, or today's event, will end in the working group. So for working group 1 at 11:40, that's in 40 minutes from now. And working group 2, there's another satellite wrap-up session if you want to stay longer. But that will be explained in the working group. So enjoy the working groups, and thank you for joining us here. Thank you to the excellent speakers this morning, and let's enjoy the rest of the event.